I never expected that night to stay with me. It had started like any other Friday evening, slipping into the routine of the week's end without any grand significance. The invitation came through a casual message from Carlos, my partner's son. He had asked if I wanted to join him for a movie, something we had done countless times before. It was part of the easy rhythm we'd developed over the past year, one built on shared interests and a mutual appreciation for quiet moments. There was nothing unusual about it, at least not at first. Carlos had always been someone I enjoyed spending time with. At 24, he had the kind of energy that filled a room, balanced by a thoughtful streak that made our conversations surprisingly layered. He carried himself with the confidence of youth, but there was something else beneath it, an attentiveness that often caught me off guard. I was 46 and well past the age of being easily flustered, but something about Carlos made me feel curiously exposed. Perhaps it was the way he listened. Or perhaps it was simply the way he looked at people, like he was trying to understand what they weren't saying. That night, we met outside the theater just before the late showing. The marquee flickered overhead, casting a soft light over the crowd gathered around the entrance. He greeted me with a grin, easy, familiar. "Hope you're ready for 2 hours of questionable acting," he joked, holding up the tickets. I laughed and followed him inside. The film was some kind of thriller, the kind that relied more on dramatic music cues than plot coherence. Neither of us seemed particularly invested in what was about to unfold on screen, but I didn't mind. The truth was, I was there for the comfort of the company, the shared silence, and the occasional whispered commentary. We chose our usual seats, last row, far corner. It was a habit more than a strategy. The seats were often empty back there, giving us the space to relax without worrying about elbow room or chatty neighbors. When the lights dimmed and the previews began, I settled into the familiar darkness, expecting nothing more than a forgettable film and a quiet evening. But almost from the beginning, something felt different. At first, I couldn't quite place it. Maybe it was the way Carlos leaned in a little closer when he made a joke about the over-the-top trailer on screen, or how his laugh lingered a second longer than usual. There was a shift in the air, subtle and slow, like the moment before a summer storm, when everything is just a little too still. I told myself I was imagining things, but then I noticed how often our arms brushed. It wasn't overt, not enough to draw attention, but enough that I couldn't ignore it. A casual touch here, a light graze there. My skin seemed hyper-aware of every contact, and my thoughts, usually so composed, began to scatter. I could have moved. I could have said something, but I didn't. Instead, I sat there, heart tapping faster in my chest, watching scenes unfold on the screen without registering a single one. I wasn't thinking about the movie. I was thinking about the way Carlos's hand had drifted just close enough to mine to blur the line between coincidence and intention. And then he looked at me. It wasn't a long look. Just a glance, really. But there was something in his eyes, curiosity maybe, or a quiet challenge. The kind of look that made you feel like you were standing on the edge of something you hadn't meant to find. The theater was nearly silent except for the hum of the projector and the occasional rustle of popcorn bags. But between us, there was a growing noise, unspoken, insistent. I didn't speak, neither did he. The rest of the movie passed in a haze. I don't remember the plot. I don't even remember the ending. All I remember is the sensation of being watched, of being near, of holding my breath for longer than I realized. When the lights came back on and the credits rolled, we sat still for a moment, as though neither of us wanted to acknowledge the shift. The quiet walk to the car was filled with unspoken thoughts and sidelong glances. We didn't talk about what had happened or what hadn't happened, but I felt it in every step. Something had changed. And once something changes, even in the smallest of ways, it becomes almost impossible to pretend it didn't. The next few days were oddly quiet. I went about life as usual, work, errands, dinners at home, but my mind kept circling back to that moment in the theater. It wasn't just the physical closeness. It was the awareness, the way my body had reacted without permission, the way my thoughts had drifted into spaces I hadn't meant to enter. And then, a week later, another message from him. New movie just came out, wanna go? No emojis, no details. Just a simple question. I stared at the screen for a while before replying. Sure, what time? The answer came quickly, followed by the film title. A drama this time, something heavier. I recognized it. A story about complicated people making complicated choices. Of course, I thought. Of course, that's the one he picked. We met again on a Thursday evening. The theater was quieter than usual, the lobby nearly empty. He greeted me with the same easy demeanor, but I noticed the way his eyes lingered when we spoke. There was a difference now, subtle but unmistakable. We chose the same seats, back row, far corner. As the trailers played, I felt the tension return. Not discomfort, just a strange electric awareness of his presence, of the space between us, of the way my shoulders seemed to drift toward his without meaning to. The film began. The screen lit up with quiet landscapes and slow dialogue. I tried to focus, but my thoughts kept slipping sideways. Then, partway through a scene where two characters sat in an awkward silence on screen, I felt it again. His hand, near mine. He didn't grab it, he didn't hold it, just placed it close. Close enough that I could feel the heat of it, close enough to know it wasn't an accident. And I didn't move away. Instead, I stayed still, breathing slow and shallow, as though any sudden movement might shatter the moment. His fingers brushed mine, once, then again, and then without a word, they slid between mine. A simple gesture. But it felt like a confession. Neither of us looked at the other. We just sat there, hands quietly joined, as the movie played on. When the credits rolled and the lights came up, we stayed seated again. And again, we said nothing on the way home. But everything had changed. The days that followed the second movie night were quieter than I expected. Too quiet, perhaps. Not in the external sense. The world kept moving, as it always does. Phones buzzing, dishes clinking in the sink after dinner, the low murmur of television in the background. But inside me, something had shifted. I found myself returning to that moment. Our fingers intertwined, the quiet press of his hand against mine, as though it were a memory from a dream I wasn't supposed to remember. It hadn't been dramatic. There were no grand declarations, no sweeping music behind the moment. Just a quiet, shared understanding. A connection that had crept into existence without ceremony. But it was there, undeniably. It lived in the space between us now, a silent passenger at every shared dinner, every hallway passing, every glance that lingered a second too long. At home, we played our roles well. Carlos was his usual self, easygoing, helpful, filled with the kind of casual confidence that comes from youth and self-possession. But occasionally, I'd catch him watching me, his gaze steady, unreadable. And just like that, I'd feel the heat rise to my cheeks, the flutter return to my chest. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that I was reading too deeply into things, that I was imagining signals that weren't really there. But deep down, I knew better. Something had been set in motion. A few days later, I came home to find a note on the kitchen counter. Just a scrap of paper, folded once with a familiar handwriting. Friday, 9:30. Same seats? There was no name, no context, but there didn't need to be. My heart thudded as I folded the paper again and slipped it into my coat pocket. By the time Friday arrived, I'd rehearsed a dozen possible scenarios in my mind. Perhaps we'd sit through the movie and pretend like nothing had ever happened. Perhaps we'd have a light conversation afterward and go our separate ways. Or maybe we'd acknowledge what we both already knew, silently, in the language of glances and presence. I arrived at the theater a few minutes early. Carlos was already there, leaning casually against the wall just outside the entrance, hands tucked in his jacket pockets. He smiled when he saw me, and I felt the knot in my stomach untie just a little. The air between us was easy on the surface. But beneath it was something else entirely. An awareness, a quiet current, pulling us towards something unnamed. "Hope you're ready for a serious one tonight," he said, holding up the tickets. "This one's got rave reviews for emotional trauma." I laughed, grateful for the levity. "Excellent, I came prepared to cry." We made our way inside, settling once again into the farthest row, the little corner of the theater that had become ours without ever being claimed. The lights dimmed, and the film began. This one was different from the last. It was quiet, deliberate. A story about people who loved each other but couldn't say it out loud. Every whispered line, every lingering look between the characters on screen felt strangely familiar, as if the story had been written while watching us. Carlos didn't speak during the film, but I could feel his presence acutely. The way he sat slightly angled toward me. The way his knee brushed against mine, just enough to notice. The way he breathed, slow, steady, but charged with something unspoken. Halfway through the film, a particularly emotional scene played out in near silence. A character sat alone on a bench, staring out over a dark lake, trying to find the courage to say something he'd been holding inside for too long. I felt a lump form in my throat, but it wasn't because of the scene. It was because I understood that feeling too well. And then I felt it. The gentle press of Carlos's hand against mine. Not forceful, not demanding, just there. I didn't look at him. I didn't need to. I turned my palm upward, quietly accepting the contact. Our fingers laced together naturally, as if they'd done it 100 times before. There, in the quiet dark, we said everything we didn't know how to say aloud. By the time the credits began to roll, I could feel the weight of his gaze on me. I finally turned to meet his eyes. He didn't smile, but there was a softness there, a kind of quiet resolve. We walked to the car in silence again, but this time the silence didn't feel uncertain. It felt intentional, like we were allowing space for the moment to settle between us. When we reached his car, he opened the passenger door for me, then paused, one hand resting on the frame. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and quiet. Do you ever feel like when you're watching something on screen, it's not just entertainment? Like it's showing you something you already knew, but hadn't admitted yet? I looked at him, startled by the question. Not because it surprised me, but because it was exactly what I had been thinking. Yes, I said. More often than I'd like to admit. He nodded, then stepped back, letting me slip into the seat. The drive home was filled with the soft hum of the engine and the occasional streetlight flickering past. Neither of us reached for the radio. When we pulled up to the house, he didn't turn off the ignition right away. He stared straight ahead, his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. I don't want this to be confusing for you, he said after a moment. I turned to him, unsure how to respond. My thoughts were tangled, my feelings scattered. But beneath all of it was a truth I couldn't deny. It already is, I admitted, but not in the way you think. He finally looked at me. His expression was gentle, but serious. Then, maybe we just stop pretending we don't feel it. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was full of things we weren't ready to name yet. That night, I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, replaying every word, every glance, every quiet second of that evening. I didn't know what came next. I didn't know what we were stepping into. But I knew, with a clarity I hadn't allowed myself before, that something real was beginning to take shape. Something fragile, yes, but honest. In the days that followed, our routines remained mostly the same. We cooked meals, watched television, exchanged pleasantries with others in the house. But whenever we were alone, even for a moment, the air between us changed. It was in the way he passed me a cup of coffee in the morning, his fingers brushing mine. In the way his gaze lingered when I entered a room. In the way I caught myself smiling whenever I heard his footsteps down the hall. One evening, I was in the kitchen rinsing out a mug when I heard him come in. He didn't say anything at first, just leaned against the counter, watching me. Movie night again? He asked, casually. I turned, setting the cup aside. Another emotional roller coaster? He grinned. This one's a little different. Thought we could watch it here. I hesitated, then nodded. Sure. That night, after everyone else had gone to bed, we sat on opposite ends of the couch, the television casting soft blue light across the room. The movie played, but again, my mind wandered. I was aware of how close he was, of the way his presence filled the space around me. 10 minutes in, he shifted closer. 15 minutes in, our shoulders touched. By the 30-minute mark, our hands had found each other again. We didn't speak during the movie. We didn't have to. When it ended, the credits rolled quietly, and I turned to him. "This isn't just about movies anymore," I said. He nodded. "I know." I looked down at our hands, still joined. "I don't know where this is going." "Me neither," he replied. "But I don't want to pretend it's not happening." There was a moment of stillness then, a shared breath, as though the world had paused just long enough for us to acknowledge the truth between us. And in that moment, I realized something important. This wasn't about age. It wasn't about roles or expectations. It was about connection, unexpected, complicated, undeniable. And it had already begun. The house was full of familiar sounds. The low rumble of the dishwasher, the soft creak of floorboards settling, the occasional clink of silverware being put away. And yet, in the quiet spaces between those sounds, something else lived. A rhythm no one else could hear. A presence that shaped every interaction, every pause, every accidental glance. Carlos and I had become experts at silence. Since that night on the couch, when the credits rolled and neither of us pulled away, something had shifted again. It wasn't just the small gestures now, the brushes of hands, the shared smiles. It was the way we carried the weight of our awareness into every room we entered. It was the way we moved around each other like dancers who knew the choreography but didn't dare perform it in full view. We didn't talk about it, not directly, but the understanding between us had deepened. There were no more questions about whether what we felt was real. The question now was how long we could exist in this suspended space where everything was known but nothing was said aloud. Some nights, we'd find ourselves in the same room after everyone else had gone to bed. He'd be sitting on the far end of the couch, legs stretched out, the light from the television painting faint shadows on his face. I'd sit nearby, pretending to scroll through my phone or sip from a cup I didn't really need. And slowly, without saying a word, the distance would close. One night, it was a documentary. Something slow and atmospheric. I can't remember the subject. Landscapes, maybe, but I remember the sound. The narrator's voice, low and even, filling the silence like background music to a moment neither of us wanted to name. Carlos was next to me, close enough that our arms touched. The contact was casual, but deliberate. I could feel the warmth of him, the steady rhythm of his breath. And when he reached for my hand, it felt as natural as reaching for the remote. We didn't kiss. We didn't speak. We just sat there, palms pressed together, fingers loosely intertwined, while the world spun quietly beyond the living room walls. It wasn't about passion, not in that moment. It was about presence, about being seen, about being known. The more time we spent like this, the harder it became to pretend we were just two people sharing a house. The hallway glances lasted longer. The shared breakfasts were filled with unspoken questions. And every time we crossed paths in the kitchen or on the stairs, a part of me braced for something to change. But it didn't. Not yet. And maybe that was what made it bearable. One evening, I was in the kitchen late, pouring myself a glass of water. The day had been long, filled with distractions and unfinished tasks. I leaned against the counter, letting the cool glass rest against my lips when I heard soft footsteps behind me. Carlos. He didn't say anything at first. Just stood there, his presence familiar now, steady and quiet. "You're up late," I said, not turning around. "So are you," he replied. I set the glass down and finally looked at him. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes held that same calm intensity I'd come to recognize. "I couldn't sleep," I admitted. He nodded, stepping closer. "Me neither." We stood there for a moment, the silence thick but not uncomfortable. Then, without asking, he reached for my hand again. It was becoming our language, that quiet act of reaching. No declarations, just connection. Do you feel like we're just waiting? He asked gently. I furrowed my brow. Waiting for what? For something to change. The question hung there, suspended in the air between us. I didn't know how to answer, because in truth, I felt it too. That sense that we were standing on the edge of something, waiting for a shift we couldn't quite control. I don't know, I said. Maybe we are. He didn't press me, just nodded and gave my hand a small squeeze. I'm not trying to rush anything, he said. I just don't want this to be something we regret not understanding while we had the chance. That stayed with me. Long after he'd gone back upstairs. Long after the kitchen lights were off, and the house had returned to its stillness. It wasn't about urgency. It wasn't about sneaking around or chasing something forbidden. It was about clarity. About understanding what this connection meant, and what it didn't. What made it so complicated was how natural it had become. The next morning, we sat at the breakfast table like any other day. The sun streamed in through the window, casting light across the table. I passed him the butter. He handed me the coffee pot. We didn't touch. We didn't exchange any lingering looks. But we both knew. Every time I looked up, I found him already watching me. The days were beginning to blur, not in a dramatic way. Life moved forward with its usual rhythm. Morning coffee, background noise from the TV, the occasional knock at the front door. But beneath the surface, something had shifted again. The silence between us had grown heavier. Not strained exactly, but full. Full with things we hadn't said, and maybe didn't know how to say. Carlos had stopped leaving notes. There was no need anymore. We both knew when the next evening would come, and we both knew we'd find each other in the same place. A quiet room, the soft glow of a screen, and two people sitting just close enough to feel the air move between them. But something about it no longer felt like a pause. It felt like a question, waiting for an answer. That night, we didn't even pretend to watch the movie. It played on, flickering across the walls, but neither of us really saw it. He was sitting beside me, shoulders angled slightly toward mine, his fingers grazing the edge of my sleeve. There's something about silence, he said softly, that makes you feel like if you break it, everything might fall apart. I nodded, unsure if he meant the silence between us, or the one in the room. Maybe both. But sometimes, he added, not saying anything becomes its own kind of answer. I turned toward him. Do you feel like we've been avoiding something? He didn't hesitate. I think we've just been trying to hold it carefully. His words settled around us. I had spent so many nights trying to understand what we were doing, what we were risking, what it meant. But in that moment, something became clear. We weren't running toward something reckless. We weren't chasing heat. We were holding something fragile, and neither of us wanted to drop it. I think about it, I admitted, more than I probably should. He looked at me, his expression unreadable but open. So do I. Then quieter. And I don't think it's going away. There was no urgency in his voice, no pressure, just the kind of honesty that only comes when pretending has become too exhausting. I didn't know what answer he was hoping for. I didn't even know what answer I was ready to give. But I knew this. Whatever had grown between us, it had taken root in stillness, in late-night rooms and quiet mornings.